You open the streaming app. You have 2 hours, you scroll for 40 minutes, and then go to bed having watched nothing. And the strange part, the part you don't say out loud, is that you weren't tired. You had the time. You had the options. Hundreds of them. And somehow, having hundreds of them meant having nothing at all. Or maybe it was the restaurant, the one with the menu that folds out 4 times. You sat there with 12 pages of food in your hands and ordered the same thing you always order, not because it was what you wanted, but because it was the only decision that didn't require you to feel anything. Your friend made a choice in 30 seconds. You envied them with a specific kind of envy you couldn't quite explain. This is the thing no one tells you about freedom. Too much of it feels like being crushed. Not loudly, not traumatically, just slowly, quietly, ground down by the weight of possibility until choosing nothing feels like the only thing that doesn't hurt. Here's what I want you to hold on to before we go any further. This isn't just about menus or streaming services. It's about the bigger choices, the ones you've been circling for months, the career pivot you've researched until you're paralyzed, the relationship you can't fully commit to because somewhere in the back of your head you keep wondering what else is out there, the apartment you didn't take because maybe there's a better one, the life that keeps feeling like a draft. Maybe this is you. Maybe you're watching this and recognizing with a faint sense of embarrassment that you have more options than almost anyone in human history, and that somehow you feel less decided, less certain, and more exhausted than people who had almost none. Or maybe it's someone you love, someone you've watched sabotage every good thing by needing to know first if there was a better thing. Either way, what I want you to understand is that this is not a character flaw. It is something far more specific than that. And once you see the mechanism clearly, once you understand exactly what's happening inside you when the options pile up, you will never experience that paralysis the same way again. Not because it goes away, but because it stops feeling like evidence that something is wrong with you. In 1955, a sociologist named Herbert Simon introduced a concept he called satisficing. It's a made-up word, a blend of satisfy and suffice, and what it describes is the way humans actually make decisions when we're functioning well. We don't scan every option. We don't optimize. We find something good enough, and we stop. That's not laziness, that's cognitive survival. The problem is what happens when you've been told, implicitly from the time you were old enough to scroll, that good enough is for people with low standards, that the optimal choice is always findable if you just look a little harder. So you look harder, and the options multiply. And then something in your brain does something quietly devastating. Psychologists call it the paradox of choice, but here's what it feels like before you know that name. It feels like standing in front of a wardrobe full of clothes and feeling like you have nothing to wear. It feels like browsing job listings for an hour and closing the tab feeling worse than when you opened it. It feels like wanting something, really wanting something, and the wanting draining out of you as soon as you realize you have to choose it over everything else. The mechanism is this. Every option you don't pick becomes a loss. Not just an unchosen thing, an actual psychological loss, because your brain is running a comparison in the background at all times, what you have versus what you could have had. The more options existed, the heavier that calculation gets. Barry Schwartz documented this in research that showed people who chose from larger sets reported less satisfaction with the thing they chose, even when it was objectively better. You can have the best option and feel worse about it than if you'd had 2 options and picked the second one. The having doesn't protect you from the losing.
Think of it like this. Choosing is not just selecting, it's amputating. Every choice cuts off every other version of events, and the wider the field, the more you're aware of how much you're cutting. So what does this look like in real people living real lives? Because it doesn't show up the same way in everyone. There are distinct patterns, distinct wounds underneath the same frieze, and you will recognize at least one of them in yourself with a specificity that might feel slightly uncomfortable. The first one is the maximizer. You know this person. You might be this person. They are the one who, before making any decision of consequence, needs to have seen everything. Not most things, everything. The maximizer does not book the hotel until they have read 112 reviews, cross-referenced 3 comparison sites, and looked at the photos so many times the photos stopped meaning anything. And here's the part that matters. They know, somewhere below the research, that the research has stopped being about the hotel. It's about the unbearable possibility of regret. The maximizer is not being thorough. They are building a legal defense in advance, a case they can make to themselves later that they did everything they could. Because if they did everything they could and it still went wrong, they can survive that. But choosing without certainty, walking into something without having eliminated every risk first, that feels, on a cellular level, like gambling with their own worth. The wound underneath maximizing is this. Somewhere early, the message landed that bad outcomes were preventable, and that a bad outcome meant you didn't try hard enough. So now every decision carries the weight of a test you cannot afford to fail. Does any of that sit somewhere specific in your chest? Then there is a quieter version of this, the avoider. The maximizer at least moves toward the decision, even slowly. The avoider just doesn't. The avoider still has the same gym membership they've had for 3 years and not canceled, because canceling would require choosing whether they're the kind of person who goes to the gym. The avoider has 6 browser tabs open right now with things they were going to look into. The avoider will tell you they're keeping their options open, and they genuinely believe this, but what they are actually doing is refusing to let any option become real, because real things can disappoint you. Unchosen things cannot. The avoider often grew up in environments where making the wrong choice had visible, lasting consequences, where the cost of being wrong was high enough that the safest move was always to delay. They learned that not deciding was a form of control, and now they carry that logic into a world where it costs them years. The thing the avoider needs to hear, not as advice but as truth, is that not choosing is still a choice, the only one with no authorship attached to it. But here is where it gets more complicated, because some people don't avoid or maximize. They choose quickly, decisively, and then immediately, quietly, begin to wonder if they chose wrong. This is the ruminator. The ruminator commits. They pick the apartment, take the job, say yes to the relationship, and then spend months conducting a silent internal audit of every reason they might have made a mistake. They scroll past the apartment they didn't take. They look up the job they turned down. They are physically present in their life and emotionally somewhere slightly to the left of it, monitoring it for evidence of error. The ruminator is not indecisive. The ruminator is someone who deeply wants to be certain and has never quite been able to feel it. Certainty for them was always conditional. There was always a caveat, so even when they choose well, the certainty doesn't arrive, and without it, they keep looking. What lives underneath rumination is grief, actually, the grief of every unchosen path. The ruminator doesn't just see the door they walked through, they see every door they closed behind them, and they feel the closing.
And then there's the last pattern, the one people talk about the least. The person who has so many options, they've stopped wanting any of them. The option fatigued. They were excited once, they could feel preferences, but after enough research, enough comparison, enough back and forth, the wanting has gone flat. They describe themselves as not really a picky person, but what they mean is, I've burned through so much decision-making energy that I have stopped being able to care. They'll tell you to choose. They mean it. They genuinely cannot locate a preference, and there is something quietly devastating about losing access to your own desire, even temporarily, because you were given too much to desire. The option-fatigued person is often also someone who is exhausted in other areas of their life, because decision fatigue is real. It is a documented cognitive phenomenon where the quality and willingness of your choices degrades across the day, but it compounds with emotional depletion in ways that aren't always obvious. Sometimes you are not overwhelmed by this decision, you are overwhelmed by everything, and this decision is just where it's finally showing up. Here's the reframe I want to offer. Not a solution, not a fix, just a different way of holding this.
You've probably understood your paralysis as a problem with you, your indecisiveness, your inability to commit, your fear of regret, your need for control, your whatever. And that framing has a logic to it. It locates the issue inside you, which means theoretically you could fix it if you were just different somehow. But here is what I want you to consider. What if the problem isn't your inability to choose? What if the problem is that you've internalized a belief that the right choice is always findable, that somewhere in the infinite field of options there is a perfect one, and that your job is not to choose, but to locate it? Because if that belief is running underneath the paralysis, then the paralysis isn't a flaw. It's a logical response to an impossible task. You cannot locate the perfect choice. It doesn't exist in the way you're looking for it, and every hour you spend searching for it is an hour you spend outside your own life, standing at the menu, waiting to be certain before you order. What would it change for you? Not as a command, but as a genuine question, if you let go of the idea that the right choice is the one that couldn't have been wrong? What if a good choice was simply one you decided to be loyal to? The question I want you to carry out of this isn't the one about your biggest life decision. It's the smaller one, the one you've been putting off not because it's important, but because even small choices have started to feel like tests. Because that's what tells you something real, not the big paralyses, the small ones, the menu, the streaming app, the moment you realize that you've been scrolling for 40 minutes and the thing you actually wanted was to sit down and feel like you'd chosen something. We are living in the most option-saturated moment in human history, and nobody prepared us for the specific kind of loneliness that comes from having everything available and still feeling like you have nothing to reach for. You're not broken for struggling with it. You're just the first generation doing it at this scale. That's not comfort exactly, but it might be the beginning of something that is. If this is something you think about, the psychology of how we make decisions, avoid them, and pay the price either way, then the next video in this series is going somewhere you probably don't expect. Not more tips, something older and stranger than that.